Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. Good morning. This is a panel discussion on Iraq, 20 years of failed post-war peace building. And it's organized in cooperation or as part of our cooperation with the Austrian Defense Ministry. We are the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, an independent research institute based in Vienna. We're doing research in the field of international politics, such as global security studies, Europe and its neighborhood, and innovation and the global governance of innovation. My name is Cengiz Günay. I'm the Deputy Director of the oiip, and my research is focusing on, I have a geographic focus on Turkey and the MENA region, particularly Turkey, Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. And I'm very much interested in state and statehood, its transformation, Islamist movements, and autocratization. But today's topic, as I said, is Iraq. It's been almost 20 years since the invasion of Iraq by the Allied, the US-led alliance of the so-called Willing, which led to the invasion of Iraq and the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime in 2003. So it's almost 20 years. It's not yet 20 years, but I think that this topic is particularly relevant in the context of the current situation, where we're facing a war in the middle of Europe and a Russian invasion on Ukraine. So I think it's very timely to think about what might or what happens after a war. How is post-war peace and state building working? Which failures do we observe on the case of Iraq, or what succeeded actually in the case of Iraq? To come back to Iraq, as I said, in 2003, the invasion of the US-led alliance led to the toppling of the Ba'ath regime, and in 2005, after a transitional period, a new constitutional constitution was issued, which has aimed to manage the country's ethnic and confessional diversity. More than 15 years later, Iraq's political system seems to be shattered. The country is more divided than ever, ethnically, confessionally, as well as politically, socially, and also the post-war system, the economic system that was established after the war, has been also in crisis for quite a time due to the recent low oil prices. Well, that has changed very recently. We might also discuss if this will have an effect on development in Iraq. In 2019, a huge protest movement, particularly in the urban areas in the south, carried by disappointed young people, asked for a kind of restart. What was quite interesting to observe is that they seem to want to overcome this consociational agreement. It was a more kind of Iraqi identity that was put forward rather than this confessional identities and ethnic identities that have been discussed in the context of post-war Iraq quite often. These protests then led to the resignation of the then Prime Minister Adil Abdul-Mahdi. And since the elections in 2021, which that they could be held was even seen as a huge success, no government has been formed ever since. And the country seems more unstable than ever. And today we will, as I said, be discussing first the developments, actually what happened immediately after the invasion of Iraq, which kind of approaches were implemented to build peace and also rebuild the Iraqi state, and what lessons can be learned from the Iraqi experience. I will introduce to the audience first our distinguished panelists. I'll start with Irene Constantini, who was a visiting fellow at our institute last year and became a dear friend. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Naples L'Orientale and adjunct professor at the University of Bologna. She holds a PhD from the University of Trento, School of International Studies, and prior to her current position, she worked as a research fellow at the University of York and the Middle East Research Institute in Erbil, Iraq. Her research interests include the politics of international interventions in conflict-affected contexts and post-conflict transition, focusing on the Middle East and North Africa region. Kamaran Palani is with the Salahaddin University in Erbil, and he's also a research fellow at the Middle East Research Institute. He did his PhD at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and his thesis was on the question of statehood and the case of Iraqi Kurdistan. Prior to his PhD, Kamaran acquired extensive experience by working with various local and international NGOs. Kamaran's research interests include the study of de facto statehood in the international system, Iraqi politics, regional Kurdish politics, internal displacement, and violent extremism in Iraq and the Middle East. He has also published broadly in international peer-reviewed journals. And third is Moritz Ehrmann, the director of one of our, so to say, sister institutes in Austria, the Austrian Study Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution, ASPR. Mr. Ehrmann began his career as an Austrian in the Austrian Foreign Service as a diplomat, and he was deployed to the Austrian OSCE Chairmanship Task Force from 2016 to 2017. He also worked in the International Committee of the Red Cross, and in these positions, he worked in Iraq, Colombia, Jordan, Ukraine, and Yemen. He has a broad international experience in that field, and from 2000 on, he has been engaged in informal international peace mediation. Last but not least, György Busztin holds a degree in Arabic history from Damascus University in Syria and a doctorate in Arabic language and Semitic philology from Roland Eötvös University. I'm sure I pronounced it wrongly, I'm sorry. In Hungary. He is a career diplomat who was appointed Deputy Special Representative of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq by Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. And previously he served the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in various positions. He was Chargé d'Affaires in Libya between 1994 and 1998, Hungary's ambassador to Indonesia, and then also to Iran between 2007 and 2018. And in that capacity also served as the European Union President in Iran. Thank you very much for participating, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Moritz, may I start with you? What was actually, could you explain what was the situation immediately after the intervention of the US-led alliance in Iraq? What kind of measures were taken? Which motivations drove the policies of the Americans and its allies, mainly the British?
Yeah, so thanks, first of all, for inviting me to this discussion with such an eminent panel of people and friends who we all have links to each other, be it through the Middle East Research Institute or by having met or having worked together in Iraq or elsewhere. So to start from the beginning, every conflict, every war has its beginning. The question is whether 2003 is the beginning of what we now see as the many consequences in Iraq, but it is certainly a very decisive moment. The motivations, the factors of motivations for conducting this invasion by the United States and their allies, I would say, had rather little to do with sort of inner Iraqi circumstances. I mean, the regime of Saddam Hussein had been a dictatorship for quite a while, had committed all sorts of atrocities against their own people. Why 2003? That had completely different reasons. Maybe, however, interesting to look at what happened afterwards and how the power structure inside of Iraq was affected by this. Well, it was not only affected, I would say it was turned upside down. Basically, the part of the system that was in power was radically taken out of power or rooted out of power, including the whole administration, including all of the security forces, and a completely new and unexperienced leadership administration was put in place gradually as the sort of Americans handed over more and more powers to representatives of the Shia majority of the country. Saddam Hussein, of course, being a member of the Sunni minority, Sunni Arab minority of the country. Many of these people who were then suddenly in power had been in exiled from the difficult time under Saddam Hussein, and were after revenge. And taking over grabbing as much power as possible, while those who were taken out of their seats of power on the various levels quickly took to the streets. Those who had been part of security forces, of course, when they left their posts inside of the security forces, took with them their guns. And there we had all the perfect ingredients for an insurgency, which, and I'm sure we're going to get to that later, took all sorts of very, very radical forms.
May I ask something? A very short question. Do you think that the de-Baathification that was promoted was a major, so to say, mistake in hindsight? And was it guided somehow by the experiences of denazification in post-war Germany? Is that something?
Well, it's always problematic to compare two completely different situations. The de-Baathification, yes, was in hindsight, of course, at least to the extent that it was conducted, quite a big mistake. I mean, we have to consider that to be anything in the Iraqi state, you had to be a member of the ruling Ba'ath party, which in consequence meant that almost everyone had to leave the administration, including the security forces. And I mean, I don't have to spell out what that would mean in any country, let alone a country that has just been invaded.
By what were the policies implemented after the invasion guided? Maybe Kamaran, could you explain a bit what happened actually? What did the so to say occupants try to implement? What was their idea?
Thank you so much. Actually, this intervention and introduction was really helpful, setting up the discussion. I just want to answer your question from a different approach. At that time, when new institutions were established, including the de-Baathification, the new security forces, it's very important to mention another important development. So very soon in Iraq, the notion of Iraq consisted of three communities, three ethno-religious communities became institutionalized, became visible and part of every single initiative, every single institution that was created after 2003. So in the parliament, in the government, in the court, anywhere. So everything became divided along these three, new identities.
This is Shia, Sunna, and Kurdish.
Exactly. So what is even more important in this context is that for the Shia, the majority of the leaders were in exile. So they just returned to Iraq. They were in London, in Tehran, in Damascus, in all these places. They lost the touch with the people on the ground, with the communities. So they came back to Iraq. They suddenly became, excluding Sadr stayed in Iraq during the last regime. The rest, the Dawa parties, the first few prime ministers of Iraq, they were all in exile prior to 2003. So they started to create new patron-clan relationships. So they tried to create new networks, benefiting from their access to this new state, resources. And they started employing people based on affiliation with their, political agendas. So that's one thing that was dominant, dynamic within the Shia community. Within the Kurds already had a de facto state, from 1991 to 2003. For them, their return to Baghdad was never about creating a new democratic, effective system in Iraq. It was about first consolidating what they had before, the de facto autonomy, border, etc. Second, benefiting from the new opportunities, new positions in Baghdad. There is a very interesting story. I met a Kurdish ambassador, Iraqi ambassador from a Kurdish community to one of the European capitals. He told me prior to 2003, he was part of the target list of this embassy, the Bas embassy in this capital. So the embassy tried to assassinate him and to kill him. And after 2003, this guy became the ambassador. So the entire power relations changed within all these communities. That's for the Kurds. For the Sunnis, it was a different scenario. As our colleague mentioned, they were in power for so many years. They were the academics, they were the doctors, they were the researchers, the intelligence security officers. So they were all excluded. And communities, these three big communities, they started to, to activate and create new PCRs, patron-client relations, but more importantly, they started to look at each other, the demands of each other, suspiciously. Kurds were viewed as as the community trying to benefit from these positions, from these opportunities in Baghdad, and the Kurds viewed the actions of Shia new party postponing the implementations of so many constitutional articles. So soon after 2003, with each of the leaders of these communities trying to consolidate their power, but also tensions and mistrust between communities increased.
Thank you. We will come back certainly to this question. György, from your perspective, what were the wrongs of the state building and peace building policies implemented in Iraq? And maybe I can also tie to that the very basic fundamental question: can any external force build peace in a different country? Isn't that probably the crux of the whole story?
Thank you. Well, this is the $1 million question, as they used to say. I think that a major problem was that America, who was in charge of Iraq as the major occupier, because true, it was a coalition. However, it was a coalition led by the United States, who had a preponderant weight and a preponderant responsibility. And they had no blueprint on what they should be doing. In terms of responsibility and how justice should be done in an authoritarian state that in many ways resembled Nazi Germany, they harked back to Nuremberg. And we understand perfectly now that it was a mistake, because this was not a copycat situation of Nazi Germany in Iraq. The other problem was that because the Arab world has no multi-ethnic, multi-confessional society comparable to Iraq except for Lebanon, that they looked at the Lebanese model, which was again a mistake, because Lebanon, true, has a number of similarities, but essentially it is a different story altogether. And they started to experiment with the issue of ethno-sectarian quotas. And this quota system, which has blatantly disregarded the Iraqi realities, has turned back the country from its very fragile and very hardly acquired gains of finding national Iraqi identity. It turned back the country into an ethno-sectarian mess. And I have heard Iraqis themselves telling me, and people from the educated class, that they had no knowledge, and this sounded extremely, extremely honest, whether they were Shia or Sunni. They knew that they were Muslims. But the whole idea of harking back to identities which simply were either non-existent or heavily oppressed during the Ba'ath period was an immense mistake. And it has torn apart the fabric of society. So I think that these complex mistakes have, to a very great extent, contributed to the problems that manifested themselves in the insurgency. And back to your question, whether an outside force can really put its imprint successfully on a country that's in a situation like Iraq was. The single positive two examples are Germany and Japan after the Second World War. But again, they cannot be compared to Iraq, because both of them were highly developed and quite homogeneous societies with none of the problems that are so specific to Iraq. So without saying in a very determined fashion that the Iraqi conundrum could have not been handled by outside intervention, I say that certainly it would have been useful if this outside intervention relied on the advice of credible Iraqis. And here I say credible with a stress, because regrettably, those people that the United States relied upon were not representative of Iraqi society. And worse than that, they had no standing and no respect among the Iraqis themselves. So with this, I stop here to give the floor to our distinguished panelists, please.
Thank you. Before addressing Irene, I just wanted to mention, this is of interest to the audience, if you have questions, you can always write them into the chat box, and then after an hour of discussion or so, I will open the floor anyways for Q&A, so we will have time also to address any questions you have afterwards too. Irene, maybe I also, based on my own experience, I was in Cairo when the invasion took place of Iraq, and I remember American journalists, young colleagues who were at that time in Cairo, celebrating the victory over Saddam Hussein. And then they started a discussion that they would want to go to Baghdad to build up the free press in Iraq, you know. And it was quite surprising to me because I would have thought that, you know, people already based in the region are more critical to that. But that brings me to the question, did the US at that time fall victim to its own discourse and normative assumption about a liberal world order and regime change and the idea of building democracy around the globe? And probably Iraq was the last example of this attempt, because afterwards, I don't remember any. Maybe you could explain a bit this question. You are on mute. Yeah, now.
In addition to what the other panelists were saying, reflecting on the very beginning of the invasion and occupation of Iraq, I would also add that the intervention in Iraq was also victim of, as you were saying, and I agree with you, with its ideological foundation, which I think was a strong character of the international intervention in Iraq since its very beginning. And we can see that also from the initial orders of the Coalition Provisional Authority that were trying to implement a model of the state, the economy and society that was very much responding to external priorities and was not really in touch with the Iraqi society back then. I mean, we should also consider that the majority of the ordinary people in Iraq welcomed the regime change back then. But they had a reluctant position towards the foreign presence in their own country, no? And also the model that were being implemented back then. So I think another issue, then, I mean, we should be wary about talking about mistakes. I think the point is that consequences were not factored in when decisions were taken. But another thing that I think it's important to stress when looking back at that initial moment is that it's also very difficult to distinguish between what were the interests of the Iraqi society and the Iraqi population and what were the interests instead of external actors and external interveners. And we can see that, for instance, with the issue of counterterrorism, that has always been a priority in the country, but the interpretation of counterterrorism has changed from 2003, when it was assumed that it was the regime that was actually promoting it, then it was the insurgency that was promoting it, and then later on we see the experience of the Islamic State. So I think that generally speaking, the international intervention in Iraq, together with the Afghanistan case, which we should also consider in this discussion when we look back at what happened over the last 20 years, they are indeed the apex of this liberal state building type of intervention. And since then, and I would say since the mid-2010 onwards, we don't see anymore anything that can resemble what happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan. This is, of course, because this intervention and the failures, by now we can talk about the failures of this intervention, were so clear and they were so heavy to digest that now the international community, and specifically European countries and the US, do no longer want to get involved in this sort of enterprise. Now you are muted.
Sorry, thank you. Now, thank you so much. Now let's make a jump into the present situation. I think we kind of analyzed and assessed the what happened after the invasion and also how this has affected development in Iraq. But a major event or development in recent years was, of course, the emergence of the Islamic State and its the fact that it controls large parts of Iraq, northern Iraq, and also Syria. The IS, well, it's not entirely defeated, but at least it's severely weakened. How would you assess, Moritz, the post-IS situation in Iraq currently? I would then also pose the same question to Kamaran, also from the perspective, like, well, how did it affect the Kurdish autonomous regions in Iraq? Moritz.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, that's quite a huge leap in time. We recently did and also published a very short study article about how narratives were affected during the times, sort of starting with the emergence of the so-called Islamic State in its then sort of most extreme form, starting from 2013. Of course, the phenomenon of the so-called Islamic State started a lot earlier, until basically 2019. What we what our conclusion was, and what we observed, also sort of through a lot of guided by quite a lot of conversations with different stakeholders that I undertook in 2013, 2014, and then onwards in Iraq, sort of showed a very typical conflict cycle. So basically, we started with extremely escalatory narratives, and concluding somewhere in 2014, when the so-called Islamic State swept over large parts of the country, made it all the way to the gates of the capital, Baghdad. As sort of this sort of very immediate victories subsided, it became more clear what the Islamic State was really about. So clear also for the people who initially supported it, amongst the Sunni population in many parts of the country. These narratives also changed, became a lot more nuanced, and eventually reconciliatory. And this is also, I would say, sort of the mood that tried to take over in the country especially after 2017, when it became more or less clear that at least on a territory level, the so-called Islamic State was defeated. And so there were, I think, quite a few initiatives led, including also led by the Iraqi government, that were sometimes supported by sort of outside actors, informal actors, official actors, yeah, I was myself part in some of these efforts, sometimes working with the Iraqi government, sometimes not, and I could see sort of within a rather short time span huge differences in the way society, or different segments or elements of society, perceived each other, so in relation to each other. So for example, personalities from Najaf, how would they perceive somebody from Mosul? How would they be received when they themselves sort of took the maybe subjective, but nevertheless in their heads maybe existing risk of going themselves to Mosul, and vice versa. Representatives from Ramadi, another Sunni city, very Sunni city, or Mosul to go to Najaf. Huge apprehensions. What I'm talking about here happened in 2019. so 2 years after the territorial defeat of the Islamic State. I mean, people feared for their lives when we suggested the idea. Within a very short time, it seems to me that at the latest, with the so-called Tashreen movement, so this movement, this protest movement that you mentioned in the beginning, these sectarian questions that haunted the country for so long are no longer at the forefront. So in my sort of perception, Iraq is moving, fortunately speaking, a lot more towards problems that many other countries face. And I say deliberately towards, because we are certainly not at such a point of being able to call Iraq a normally functioning country. But also consider the fact that all the last power transitions, including during the very critical time of 2014, in the middle of the crisis around the so-called Islamic State, even then, power transition between the then Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and later Prime Minister Adil Abdul-Mahdi occurred peacefully and through democratic means. You could question sort of how democracy functions in Iraq, and the quota system was already mentioned, hugely hampers sort of how democracy is able to function in Iraq. However, democracy exists in Iraq, and it does so in a very lively form. Civil society exists in Iraq in a very, very lively form. You can talk, you can speak your mind in Iraq, in workshops, in all kinds of formats. Yes, there is certain limits where that if you go too far, might get you killed, as has also been unfortunately seen recently in several examples. Nevertheless, compare the situation to so many other countries in the region. You'll be surprised what's possible there that is possible now in Iraq. You're on mute. We cannot hear you.
Sorry, I won't go on mute anymore. So I always forget to unmute myself. Thank you so much. Before going to Kamaran, just a follow-up question, a very brief one. What are the limitations for the expression of thought? Is that mainly concerning the limitations Iran has been imposing, and why is there why have the political forces failed to form a new government ever since October 21? Is that also related to Iran?
So yeah, two quite distinct but very relevant questions. I would so sort of the most concrete people of speaking their mind and being persecuted or killed because of it, I would say has mostly to do with the informal armed actors in Iraq, the so-called militias, some of whom are part of the so-called popular mobilization fronts, and yeah, of course, their own struggle with what Iraq is becoming. I mean, Iraq is not a #1 conflict country anymore, and so armed actors that were a direct result of this conflict that was so violent in the past are struggling to deal with that, and they're doing this by the means that they possess, which is their weapons. So this is to answer the first part of your question. The second part of your question, well, we are in March, yeah. So it is quite a period of time to form a new government, and yeah, again, I would say the reasons for that is a certain. It's very simply put, but I think one of the main reasons for that is is the question, is Iraq moving away from a sort of consensus government where basically all major stakeholders get a share of the power, and which in turn also did such a good job on paralyzing the country? Is the system slowly shifting towards some form of majoritarian government that would, in this case, be led by the Sadrist bloc that, of course, sort of went victorious from the 2021 elections, and yeah, of course, at the same time, those who would not be part of such a majoritarian government resisting and demanding, as it was in the past, their place at the places of power.
Thank you, Kamaran. How were the Kurdish autonomous regions affected? How do you see this region positioned within Iraq? And I know it's lots of questions, but if you could also touch upon the question whether, I mean, the Kurdish autonomous region is mainly controlled by two huge parties that have kind of divided powers in this region. Is this system stable, or do you see any changes there?
Thank you. You have raised so many interesting questions. Even I want to share some quickly my thoughts on your previous questions to Moritz. In addition to the year of 2003, I always argue that there are other three equally important years: 2014, 2017, and 2019. 2014, as you mentioned, ISIS emerged, took control over most of the Sunni Arab majority provinces in northern part of the country, including Nineveh, Anbar, and others. And they were so close to Erbil, so close to Baghdad. At that time, another important development happened. Kurds expanded their territorial control. It was beyond the expectation and hope of the most optimistic person that Kurds can control Kirkuk, all of the disputed territories. Suddenly, within few days, the territory of Kurdistan expanded by 50%. The Shia army, the Shia-led Iraqi army collapsed. New militias, new armed groups either created or activated. So the year of 2014 also as important as 2003. This led to, from the Kurdish side, they were pushing for the referendum for independence because they saw there's a huge opportunity. Now they are in control of all of the territories that Kurds have been historically claiming. Kirkuk, Nineveh Plains, and the entire territories that they have been claiming for so many decades. Now they are in control. Why we should not declare independence or go towards independence? That's the perception of the leadership in the field. 2017, two important events happened. One is the retaking of Mosul. In my view, which I always argue that it was also not about only retaking Mosul from Daesh, but it was also about addressing the Sunni question, because we cannot understand the rise of ISIS without explaining the Sunni question, post-2003 Sunni question and resistance in Iraq. And another important, it was a referendum in September 2017, which was about the Kurdish question. I think the international community not only made external powers made a mistake in 2003, but also made a huge mistake in 2017. They did not help in accommodating these two questions into the new Iraq, the Kurdish question and the Sunni question. What happened in Mosul? They sent armed groups, militias. Now, in all of these regions which were retaken from Daesh, the main security actors are the Iranian-backed armed groups in the Sunni Arab majority areas. For the Kurdish issue, they sent tanks, to Kirkuk to reclaim this territory. So they important opportunities missed as well in 2017. In 2019, and then we had the protests in Baghdad. The protests are really important because in 2003, we had this notion of these three communities. The Sunnis are Baathists, are supporters of, I'm not talking about the perception of other communities, supporters of terrorist groups, Shia, etc., etc. So now the problem is, the protests have just transformed the tensions between communities into within the communities. Now the main demands and concerns of Kurds are towards the Kurdish authorities. They no longer blame the other communities. They blame their own authorities. The same thing within Shia. The majority in Iraq, the people, the younger population, don't really buy any, rhetoric, based on enemy construction, threat construction, against the other communities. They blame their own leaders. So I think this is the major change in Iraq, which people start to challenge the legitimacy of the existing and traditional powers within their own communities. I just want to add one sentence regarding the government formation process, which we are at the moment. I think there is a very important development. Recently, the Iraqi Supreme Court, under the influence of Iran and Iranian-backed, groups, announced a decree, issued a decree explaining the Constitution or interpreting the Constitution. I think the majority government has not only become difficult, it has become extremely, extremely difficult for now and for the future. The Supreme Court has further institutionalized the consensus government. They require 220 members of the parliament to attend the session of electing president, which at the moment it is just not possible for the main winners of, the main Sunni victors within Sunni communities, within Kurds, within Shia, to reach to 150. So for me, the current, tensions have further institutionalized the consensus government, which is the main driver, which was the main driver for the October protests, which is the main driver for the dysfunction of the Iraqi political system, and we are just not there to provide a new alternative to the consensus and power sharing arrangement.
Thank you. I'll ask Irene next. We have heard about these rather positive developments at the grassroots that are challenging the post-war system and its consociational character. And it seems like there is a movement in all these different ethnic and confessional groups that is pushing for a severe change. So this is at the grassroots. What else is happening at the grassroots, Irene, in terms of peace building? Because we also heard that there are militias, armed militias, that have were very important in the fight against the so-called Islamic State, and that are still having their weapons and arms. So how would you see, where are the dangers and chances of this grassroots, of the development at the grassroots? Militarization, and also at the same time kind of a democratic movement that is pushing for change.
Yes.
Irene,
So,
yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I think we should make a clear divide between society and the political representative in Iraq. So I agree with Moritz and Kamaran. The Tishrin movement, so the protest movement from 2019, but also we should remember that wave of protests occurred also before, since at least 2011, and with this idea of moving beyond ethno-sectarianism since 2015 onwards, they do ask for going beyond an ethno-sectarian logic within the country political system. Yet, and I think this is what is blocking the government formation process, this is not what is driving the Iraqi political leadership, which is still working according to that logic. And that's the reason why it's taking so long. Well, that in Iraqi time it's not that long, because government formations in the past took even longer, but that is there is this discrepancy between what society is asking and what the political leadership in Iraq is actually willing to give to its own society. And this can be explained, I would say, simply because the existing Iraqi political leadership has as its own goal their own survival. And without the ethno-sectarian formula, they cannot survive within the country. Because of course, there are so many demands that are met by from the population that are met that, of course, as we have seen, there is this push from the grassroots against their own political elites. When it comes to instead the peace building, where of course external actors are more involved, here we see that since 2017, so since the defeat of the Islamic State, well, since 2014, basically the international community went back to Iraq. So it left in 2011 because it seems that the situation was under control, and it came back after the experience of the Islamic State, military, but also on intervention at the grassroots level for peace building. Limiting what I'm gonna say to the second aspect, I think that there has been an effort towards creating what is now called social cohesion in Iraq, but with some limits in what has been achieved in the country. So we see that major efforts have been going into the areas affected by the Islamic State, with a logic of favoring better relationship between communities, or whether it was for countering extreme violent extremism and so on. But then we see that some of the basic issues in Iraq are not actually addressed by this type of intervention. Simply put, in terms of geography, for instance, while the majority of peace building efforts have been devoted to the Nineveh governorates, there is in action need, but very little, for instance, has been done in the south of the country, where this protest movement has actually been the strongest, and where there are many unresolved issues that have nothing to do with ethno-sectarianism, but they have a lot to do with the socioeconomic development in the country.
And how does these, because this seems to be rather different from the peace building approaches that were kind of implemented right after the invasion. So can we see a shift in the scope also of peace building initiatives? It's like where it was previously more top down, and the idea to build the state or rebuild the state and kind of create peace through the rebuilding of the state and its institutions. Can we say that it has more shifted now to kind of strengthening communities, capacity building in the communities, in the grassroots, and so on and so forth? So more modest, so to say, approaches. Is that true? And have the actors changed, the international actors? Is it now more civil society organizations that are involved, or is it still the state?
Yeah, I do see a change, and I do see an important change. I always like to say that international intervention are sort of experimental practices, means of intervening change, but also the scope of intervention change. So if, and this is quite evident if you take the notion of stability, no? So back in 2003, if you look at the debate, the discourse, the policies, the idea was that what you needed was like democracy, a working economy, a strong civil society in order to have a stable society in Iraq. Now, I would say since the mid-2010 onwards, actually you have a different interpretation of stability. Stability is interpreted mostly in security terms. So you actually need a stable country to then eventually build something else. And together with this different interpretation, there is not really a different actors, but actually there is a different role of international actors in conflict-affected countries. And so in the past, with this liberal state building intervention, they took responsibility for what was the outcome of the intervention, no? So in a very quasi post-colonial way, they were saying, we know what to do and what you need. While now, of course, they are wary of taking all these responsibilities precisely because not only we saw that this approach didn't actually work in contexts such as Iraq and Afghanistan, but also because international conditions changed with new actors and new dynamics going on in the world, and so there is no longer this the possibility of having this sort of intervention worldwide in conflict-affected countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You also mentioned one of the keywords, something I wanted to ask György. Other actors, said Irene. And one of the major actors with a heavy weight in Iraq is Iran, of course. So how would you assess the role of Iran in Iraq and for its stability? And I also come back to this question of the militias that are, where some are controlled by Iran. What role do they play in the context of what we have just assessed?
Thank you. Iran traditionally, and I'm not telling you a secret, is looking at Iraq as its extension. And this does not have to do only with a concept of geography or concept of polity, but it has to do with the fundamental optics of Iran about itself and the world. Iran is not thinking in terms of a nation state. It is thinking in terms of Shia Islam and Islam in general. And the ruling elite in Iran firmly believes that it has a mission and a duty to extend its influence over all Shiite Muslims in the Middle East and beyond. And this notion, of course, reflects very strongly on Iraq. And it was one of the great mobilizing forces behind the Iranian campaign to rid Iraq of ISIS. And we have to acknowledge that Iran paid a very heavy price in treasure and blood rather, to achieve this objective. However, the situation has changed very dramatically after ISIS was, vanquished, and it became evident that the country cannot alone solve the problems that were left behind, the carnage of the insurgency and the carnage of the caliphate rule. However, tragically, Iran could not provide anything that was meant to be constructive to restart a rebuilding of Iraq along the lines that most Iraqis opted for. Iraqis did not and are not willing to live under theocratic rule. they want to preserve the positive gains, I should say, of secular and democratic rule, even if they are disappointed with the performance of their consecutive governments and how democracy functions. The uprising of the young as of 2019 has very clearly proved that Iraqis are not willing to live under whatever form of outside influence. And here comes the major contradiction that all our distinguished panelists have pointed to, that the country is reeling from the proxy presence, I have no better expression for it, of these militias which find their political direction and their financing in Iran. This, of course, makes Iran a very powerful player in Iraq, but powerful but not omnipotent. And in Iran's influence inside Iraq, you will find inherently the seeds of Iranian influence being undone in Iraq, because enough is enough. Wider and wider segments of Iraqi society are becoming fed up with the day-to-day management of Iranian interests via the proxy forces and via the different political groupings that are representing Iranian influence. And the elections, with all their, let us put it very mildly, deficiencies, because we know perfectly well that these were not Westminster-style elections, still produced a result which clearly indicated the rollback of Iranian influence in Iraqi politics. Those political groups and parties that were most identified with Tehran have performed miserably. They have only garnered a fraction of their former seats, which in itself does not mean that Iran's influence has automatically been reduced in Iraq. It means that the Iraqi public lost its trust in the Iranian-style solutions. Iran will still look at Iraq as a major and indispensable extension, especially with regard to its role in Syria and in Lebanon. There's no way that Iran would give up its influence in Iraq. How this translates into politics, it's another issue. And ideally, should there be an agreement in your neighborhood in Vienna this week or the week after, and should this enormous pressure of maximum pressure sanctions on Iran be even incrementally, slowly alleviated, this will be fantastic news for Iraq, because it automatically means that Iran will have other outlets. Iran will not be solely dependent on what it is currently doing in Iraq. And hopefully all those forces that want to have a normal relationship between Iraq and Iran, which would be the order of the day, will get more oxygen, and there can be a rethinking of the nexus of the two countries, Iraq and Iran, who, by the way, are still in a state of war. We tend to forget this. There is only a ceasefire between these two countries. And why? Because so far, it was neither in the interest of Iraq, neither in the interest of Iran to go beyond this situation. With a new situation emerging in Iran, maybe this paradigm will change. I stop here because I think...
No, thank you so much for mentioning also the GCPO and the negotiations on that. You know, the world has radically changed in the last 10 days or so, ever since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And I know it's pure speculation, but do you think, because I mean, what you highlighted reminded me a bit of the tensions between Russia and Ukraine once Ukraine started to kind of or trying to leave the orbit of Moscow. Do you think that, as I said, it's pure speculation, but do you think that Iran would be willing to invade Iraq in case that Iraq kind of takes another direction, and if these grassroots initiatives and movements are successful, and is Tehran willing to accept an independent and Iraq that is kind of deciding its own orientation?
Well, Mr. Putin wanted to lead us back into the law of the jungle, but I hope he will fail, and all indications are that he will fail. And I want to remind you that even Iran, in its very difficult and precarious situation, has mildly condemned what Russia is doing in Ukraine for the very reasons that all small states in the shadow of great powers are feeling jittery about what's happening. We should not forget that Iran fought 2 major wars with Russia in the 19th century and lost huge territories to Russia. And the Russian influence over Iran during and after the Second World War was still very powerful. So Iran, I believe, is much more intelligent, cultured, and sophisticated than to think about such methods. Iran will go after its interests, no question about that. How it will do it and how these methods will follow the developments in international politics and the situation on the ground is another matter. But for Iran now, a major and very important objective should be to restore its relations with the Gulf countries, to restore its standing in the wider region, also mending fences with Turkey, and gradually coming back on the world stage. As soon as these sanctions are removed, I think we can start thinking about Iran in a very different context.
Thank you so much. This is I just want to remind all participants who are in the audience, if you have any questions, please write them into the chat and we will address them. Meanwhile, I would like to do a last round where I would kindly ask you to be brief with your responses. What lessons can be learned from the Iraqi experience? I know it's a difficult question, and where do you see the future? Are you positive? Because I kind of heard these, at least it sounded to me as if these developments at the grassroots are a positive development, and there is a potential for a fundamental change. Do you see any of this change coming soon or not? And what are the examples or the experiences we can learn from the Iraqi example? I would like to turn the order and start probably with Irene and then go to György, Kamaran, and Moritz.
Wow, this is a difficult question.
I know, a tough one, Abdullah. And I ask you to be brief.
Yeah, precisely. This is a very difficult question to answer. I mean, lesson learned. Well, I would limit lesson learned for the Iraqi case, because then I think it's very difficult, as I think we all mentioned during this event, that then extending them to other contexts is very difficult. Mm-hmm. But I would say that, well, first of all, there needs to be, so it's a matter of balancing also the different levels in which the crisis of Iraq unfolded over the period, over the last 20 years or so. So basically there needs to be a de-escalation of the tensions between the 2 key actors at the international level, so the US and Iran over Iraq, because without that, there is no external condition for enabling developments in the country. Then I think that the issue of the Iraqi political leadership needs to be addressed as well, with an important change in the the composition of these elites. And I'm saying so because I think one of the key points that Iraq needs to face in the near future, and I think it's one of the countries that show it the most, is the challenge of dealing with climate change, which is not something that needs to be left out. Usually it is left out from our analysis, but it is really a country where you see the consequences of climate change, and you see them now. And in order to tackle them, you need a reset of the political leadership, because you need brave policies, specifically in a country that over the last 10 years doubled its own oil production and is extremely dependent on oil economy and so on. So I think that to face this new challenge, the country needs to resolve all the deadlocks that it created in the past.
Thank you so much, Irene. György, just follow up, do you think that the rising oil prices will be to the benefit of Iraq? I mean, we are all suffering under the oil and gas prices, but you know, it was a severe, it really challenged the income of this country, the low oil price. Do you think that the high prices will have a positive effect? And then what are the lessons learned from the Iraqi example? What would you say?
Well, evidently they are very beneficial to Iraq so long as they last. And in two brackets, I have to say that the delay of the formation of a new government might also be beneficial to Iraq. I wish to apologize to anyone who disagrees, but I have to tell you that the current government of Iraq, with its current prime minister, and especially its current minister of finance, Mr. Ali Al-Alawi, to me, they are guarantees that the additional income from oil that is hugely important for the country will not disappear in private pockets. And this is of extreme importance because Iraq faces grinding enormous problems of poverty and mismanagement, and additional sources can somehow alleviate these problems and their social effects. And on the other side of the question that you have addressed to me, I think there is no better solution than to return to the UN Charter. The UN Charter is such a beautiful document. Should the whole world abide by what the UN Charter tells us, that the powerful should never use their power to intimidate and subjugate the weak. What we are seeing now in horrific scenes, and honestly, neither my wife, neither me, we can sleep after looking at the horror that is going on in our direct neighborhood. I'm Hungarian, and I think all of us feel the same way in Europe. I believe that no precedent can ever vindicate what happens now in Ukraine, and Iraq, sadly, is something the United States of America should deeply regret, because what they have done there, unfortunately, it was a total miscalculation. Even if Saddam Hussein was an abomination and Iraq should have been rid of him, all this should have happened by and through the Iraqi people themselves, and not by outside intervention. So I hope that this lesson will not be lost on either the United States or anyone else, and the horror that is happening now will also be a footnote to this lesson. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see a comment by Wolfgang Mühlberger. Hi, Wolfgang. Nice to see you, friend. He has 3 questions. But before going to his questions, maybe I'll finish this last round. Kamaran, please, what is your view? What lessons can be learned, and where do you see Iraq's future, near future?
As I've quickly mentioned, the new elites within all these communities have begun to create new patron-clan relationships. They became patrons to certain factions. However, they became also clients to certain regional patrons. You know, Turkey became patron to certain Sunni factions, Iran to Shia, and then UAE Gulf. I think the major problem was that the regional powers, the old and emerging powers in the region, looked at the invasion of Iraq as a threat, but also an opportunity to expand their influence, and they never helped the parties to reconcile. Turkey always, you know, even when had problems with KDP and KRG, but did not push KDP towards Baghdad. So they, you know, they always wanted to have, you know, tension between these governments and these factions. The same thing true for the regional countries. I think the lesson was that there was not only the lack of plan to rebuild the country internally, but also the lack of plan what to do with the regional powers, how to address their concerns, but also their ambitions. At the moment in Iraq, what I'm seeing on the ground, the international actors are, their interest is declining, their influence is declining. So the internal actors have become more vulnerable to regional powers. The Sunni factions during the government formation went to UAE and Turkey, and where they reached and signed the agreement. And the Shia factions look at Tehran still. So I think the more influence of regional powers is also a huge, huge challenge for the future of Iraq.
Can I address one of the questions Wolfgang posed? The first one, is the national dialogue going anywhere? Would you like to address this question?
I think there is, at the moment, there is no national dialogue.
Okay, that was brief.
There is not such an initiative. The entire focus is on the government formation. And as I've mentioned, the tensions are within the communities. So maybe another intra-communal dialogue that we needed in order to build a foundation for broader national dialogue.
Thank you, Kamaran. Moritz, what lessons do you see we can learn from the Iraqi example, and where do you see the near future of Iraq?
Yeah, since I'm last, I can be extremely brief because colleagues have already said most things, and also I find Wolfgang's questions very interesting. So, sort of immediate future, do I see a strong hope for fundamental change? No. Incremental change, I think, is what we are seeing, and what we can continue to hope for, hopefully as quickly as possible. What we can learn from the Iraqi experience, and we can, I think, directly project that also to what is going to be the consequences of the conflict or the war on Ukraine, is that after such devastating wars that are put on a country, we will need a very, very long breath to deal with the consequences. And I think this is still visible in Iraq, and we see that anywhere else, and we will see that in the aftermath of Ukraine as well. May I also say something on the national dialogue issue?
Yes, please, because you seem to disagree with Kamaran. I'd be interested to hear your opinion.
Yeah, because there is two separate initiatives that exist under that name of completely different nature. One sort of that was launched by the still current Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi, which is a little bit difficult for me as a non-Iraqi to understand what exactly is meant by it. It is the sort of dialogue that takes place between political parties, and that, to my view, is increasing also compared to the past. It's dialogue that the government leads also with the protest movement and many other actors. But it is something very unstructured and informal. Then there's another initiative that is led by European actors, including supported by the European Union, which is basically a public platform for different where different issues are discussed amongst Iraqi stakeholders. There was a recent platform, for example, in Mosul. There was one in Najaf, and they run under this sort of logo as the National Dialogue platform, and this is also supported by the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Moritz. Another question posed by Wolfgang is how is the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iraq evolving? Maybe I can ask György or pose this question to you. Do you see any progress in that regard, and how does it affect the relations with Iran?
Yes, I see progress. My understanding is that just maybe 2 to 3 days ago, there was a high-level meeting that was meant to reduce frictions that still existed on a technical level, which prevented some of those projects taking off, which were previously agreed between the two countries. And it's quite impressive. On one hand, they have reopened, to my understanding, the border crossing in Arar, which was closed essentially since the time of Saddam, not even since 2003, since before that. This is a major step because we know that there are tribes straddling the two sides of the border, and you have families torn apart, and you have a lot of trade potential and human movement potential between the two countries, which could in effect take off with normal traffic reinstated between the two countries. And what is also of great importance, there is talk about the electricity grid between the two countries connected. Now, this would be extremely important. I'm not entirely familiar with the electricity grid of the Gulf nations, but I'm aware that it could be a major contribution to solving one of the most grinding problems of Iraq, which is the unpredictability of the electric supply to the population. So therefore, I hope that this will be an addition to more energy security for Iraq, which would not only make life easier for Iraqis, but it would be a major achievement for the current government, which I believe deserves a lot of credit for all these attempts to mend fences with both Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the Gulf countries. And I hope it will pay off.
Thank you so much. Another question by Wolfgang is, what about the Iraqi attempts to perform the role as a regional mediator? Kamaran, would you like to?
Yeah, I did some more topic actually.
Yeah, please.
One of the objectives of America was to create ties and strengthen the relations between the current government, the Kazemi-led government, with the Sunni Arab countries, as an attempt to reduce the Iranian in Iraq. So that America has been also important player, and also we have seen in parallel to the protests, we have seen a growing sense of Iraqi nationalism among Shia, to trying to associate themselves, with the Arab community in the region. So this, dynamics influence the desire of Baghdad to play this role. However, for me, it was for the Iraqi side, it was more symbolic to establish itself as a regional player, as a bridge between all this. It does not have the enough power to consolidate this initiative, because my argument is that external sovereignty depends on domestic sovereignty. And Iraq lacks domestic sovereignty. If you don't have, monopoly over your territory, the use of violence, it's very hard to be seen as a sovereign in a regional environment. So this was a good attempt, and the second most important achievement of the Kazemi government after preparing the country for the pre-elections, but it is still not enough for Iraq to play this role.
Thank you, Kamaran. Irene and Moritz, do you have any closing remarks? Irene?
No, I mean, I agree with what the panelists said, generally speaking. Perhaps the only thing that I want to add is that I would like to see Iraq playing a role as mediator in the region. I think it has great potential to do so, as long as it solves its internal issues first. And then I think it is an asset for the region and for the challenge that we see in the region. So I think there is a role to be pursued. But yeah, as Kamaran was saying, maybe it's not yet there.
Thank you. Moritz, is there anything I should have asked you but haven't?
Probably many things, but since we're talking about this interesting topic of sort of Iraq's regional role, let me also add my 2 cents of wisdom and maybe also experience in also, since we're also dealing actively with this issue. So, I mean, from my perspective, what the Kadhimi government, because this really is an initiative of the Kadhimi government and some specific advisors that work for him. So what they have pulled off in this extremely short period that Kadhimi is in power in Iraq, in terms of balancing Iraq's, not only balancing Iraq's own relations to as has already been pointed out, Sunni Arab countries in the region, but also towards the big neighbor Iran, is quite impressive. And I think the summit in Baghdad in August last year is a very impressive expression of this. Now, of course, after the summit, 2 months later, there were elections. I asked this question to one of the relevant sort of ministers in the Kadhimi government. So what's going to happen afterwards? Because they were already talking about Baghdad 2, Baghdad 3, and so on and so forth. Now there hasn't been a Baghdad 2. There hasn't been a Baghdad 3. We have no idea who is going to lead the next government. So therefore, so how Iraq is going to continue in this role, I wouldn't call them a mediator, but perhaps a regional platform for improving sort of relations between antagonists in the region. So whether that is going to continue or not, for me, is completely open.
Thank you so much, Moritz. And we are out of time. We just finished at 12:30 as scheduled. So thank you all for keeping the time. Thank you for a great discussion. I'm sorry we just, of course, could only scratch on the surface, and it would have been great to go more into depth in this or that area. I hope we can continue this conversation. Thank you so much for your participation and your contributions. Thank you to the audience for staying with us until the end and listening and also making your comments. Stay tuned with our institute. We are planning on the 21st of March. We do have planned an online event with a highly distinguished panel on the war in Ukraine and its repercussions on the international order. It will be at 3 p.m. and we will announce it in due time. So stay tuned with us and follow also our website and follow us on Twitter. Thank you so much. All the best to Singapore, Iraq, Italy, and Moritz, where are you, in Schleining or?
Eisenstadt.
Eisenstadt, and all the best to Eisenstadt from Vienna, from the OIP. See you soon. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. We have recorded it, and you will have also the opportunity to distribute it if you're interested. I think it was a great discussion. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Cengiz. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Ciao.
All the best.
Thank you.